You know how there's many different conspiracy theories regarding the fast food industry here in America? Like the ones that claim that McDonald's uses human meat for their beef patties, or the ones that claim that McDonald's is trying to lure kids into the Illuminati and New World Order via people like Ronald McDonald and others. Don't believe me? Look at a segment of Alex Jones or some other conspiracy theorist here on YouTube and tell me that it isn't there. Now, whether or not these things are true or not, it really doesn't seem to bother me, or many other people for that matter. Mostly because of the fact that we can all rest assured that these things are most likely fake. I mean, think of it. You can't spell believe without lie in the middle of it. So likely chances they're all a bunch of lies that are perpetrated by a bunch of crazy, right-wing nutjobs out there to try and demonize something that's honestly the least of their problems, instead of particularly focusing on real issues out there. With that being said though, there are a few things regarding the meat that is used by McDonald's though. For one, it looks about as small as a hockey puck when heated up. Secondly, it's got a lot of crap in it that makes it taste rather different compared to other beef patties. Which I guess is an understatement, as anything that McDonald's sells, food-wise, is different altogether. Not to mention that most of the food there served there never rots. I'm not kidding with any of you here. That shit never, ever rots. It just dries up for the most part. Now, of course, some people may try and debunk this by pointing out to a video where a guy from Super Size Me did an experiment with some of McDonald's food, but take a few things into consideration. Number one, that movie has been debunked by numerous health officials and the like, including some people who actually took part of the challenge themselves. Number two, the reason for the fast food burgers specifically becoming rotting in the first place is because of the condensation due to the steam, thus that produces mold and pretty much putrefying everything in the process, with the sole exception of fries, that is. Now, for anybody wondering, no, I personally do not care for the fast food industry, or even McDonald's themselves as a corporation, or their practices. But even I know that a person can easily spell out some bullshit, slap and edit a few clips, make a video, and call it a day. People are manipulative, no matter what side they're on. So what does this have to do with my story? A lot, actually. You see, while I certainly can tell you that there is no human meat in McDonald's patties, nor is there any kind of Illuminati mind-altering substances laced into each and every meat patty that's served out, there is something else in the meat that I don't think anybody has ever been able to particularly track down. At least until now. This specific ingredient is one that is kept under a heavy lock and key and held by the higher-ups and staff at the McDonald's corporations. Nobody, with the sole exception of the CEO and lab testers, can enter into the small vault that's guarded by a janitor's closet. Gross, but at the same time kind of impressive. This ingredient is called EXP43. No, there's no acronym for it. That's just the name. This ingredient was actually comprised by Ray Kroc at least 6 months before he passed away in 1984. What this ingredient does is still kind of debated by most people. At least the ones that know about it, that is. But from what I could possibly piece together, this scientific ingredient, or specific ingredient, is dropped from a dropper at a huge 100-ton sized tub of meat before it's formed into the patties that are sent to McDonald's. The ingredient itself supposedly not only keeps the meat from spoiling, but also provides an additive punch to the people out there who eat it, thus making them addicted to it. Think of it as if it were liquid opiates, but made for food. That's pretty much what it is. Now, before this was actually incorporated as the main ingredient into the McDonald's beef, the corporation did an experiment on the substance to make sure of it that it was safe for consumption, or at least safe in their own form and way of calling it safe. The project was dubbed the Cheeseburger Experiment by the main staff and crew who worked on the project. The main testing was relatively simple in and of its own self. They would be controlled experiments that would involve 2 unnamed subjects consuming a series of McDonald's cheeseburgers over the course of 3.5 days. One subject received a series of burgers that was laced with the ingredient EXP43, while the other one was served the regular hamburgers without any ingredients added to it, other than the ones that were already provided inside the sandwich during preparation. As each customer ate their respective sandwiches, Subject 1 immediately mentioned the delicious taste of the beef that almost instantly made him consume the rest of the sandwich in a quick manner. He claimed that the beef had a much more succulent and juicier taste and texture that he had never had in a McDonald's hamburger before. Meanwhile, Subject 2, the one without the EXP43 edition, enjoyed the burger but found it to be rather lacking in terms of flavor, and that the meat was actually pretty dry and hard to chew, likely from a few people probably overcooking the meat. The various selected scientists that had been monitoring the subjects' overall reactions had taken this to be a rather good sign of future profits for the company. So each subject was sent home after the day's experiment and told to document the rest of their day in a journal and hand it in once they came back the next day, to which the two agreed. Originally, the project was only supposed to have a small dosage of the ingredient EXP43 to be included into the burger patties for each day of experimentation. However, a quick email from the higher-ups at McDonald's demanded that more of the ingredients be placed onto each sandwich for the first subject to see how addictive they could make the meat. There were a few objections to this decision, as many of the scientists performing the experiments feared that, if increased, the ingredient would do a lot more harm than good. However, like with most corporations, their attentions to potential profit were enough to shroud out their conscious judgment. So with much hesitation, the next series of patties were prepared, but with much larger doses of the ingredients, and stored for the next day. The following morning, the two subjects returned to the testing location and, like as before, gave their journals to the scientist for evaluation. The two were then placed back into each chamber, and the same experiment from before had taken place, with very little difference other than the increasing amount of the ingredient in the burger patties. The first subject who had been given the burgers, upon tasting them, slowly took his time in eating them. In fact, he actually ate a lot slower than how most people would normally eat, even the slower ones. 5 minutes had passed, and the first subject hadn't even finished his first sandwich, while the other subject finished them all rather quickly due to the size that they were. This intrigued the testers quite well, seeing as how the man wasn't even allowing a single drop of mustard or ketchup to fall from his face, or from the burger itself, and if for some reason any fragments did happen to fall, he would scoop it up with his fingers and eat it right then and there without any kind of hesitation. It took the subject a good hour or so to finish up the rest of the sandwiches, and upon completion, he simply stared off into space, and wouldn't even answer any of the questions that the testers were asking him at the time. After another hour, the first subject seemed to snap out of whatever daze he was going into, and then proceeded to thank the men behind the counter watching him for the food, and then asked if he could go back home. He was allowed to, but was instructed as before to write in the journal about the rest of his experience. Upon his leave, the scientist prepared to email the higher-ups once again about the day's experiments, following the strange occurrence from the first subject as before. The higher-ups then wind up ordering the rest of the EXP43 to be dumped into the vat of meat that was used in the experiments to serve the both of the subjects, for the last day of testing. This, like the last one before, had caused a ruckus between the group and the McDonald's corporations, which turned rather aggressive. From what was documented, half of the staff that had been working on the project quit immediately upon hearing about what exactly was going on, while the others stayed out of fear of being blacklisted from the McDonald's corporations of any future jobs if they failed to comply with their demands, which McDonald's, over the phone, was willing to do without any kind of hesitation. So, with as much hesitation and guilt, the rest of the ingredient was mixed in with the meat, promptly cooked and served for the final day. The two men then came back to the testing lab at the same time as the last two. However, something seemed wrong about the first subject. He looked as if he hadn't slept in nearly a week. Followed that in the fact that he had various grease and sauce stains splattered all over his shirt and pants. When asked about what had happened to him, he simply said that he was really hungry after the experiment, and then proceeded to go out and binge on McDonald's hamburgers for his dinner. When also asked about the whereabouts of his journal, he said that he had wound up losing it while rummaging in the house, stealing money out of his wife's purse and his son's piggy bank in order to feed his addiction. which he freely admitted without any kind of upsetness or remorse or anything. That already was a red flag in many of the minds of the scientist. But of course, as per protocol, they brought the two men into their chamber and served them the tainted meat. The first subject, after taking the bite, nearly lost his shit afterwards, and that managed to take everyone off guard. The subject immediately started to devour every single sandwich that was provided to him, eating everything off of the sandwiches, including the wrapper itself. Once he had finished with the sandwiches, he instantly became aggressive and demanded more hamburgers be made and served to him. The scientist reluctantly did as told, and more batches of hamburgers were cooked and served to the man, who shoved them all down his gullet in the most disgusting manner possible. The amount of disgusting slurping sounds, chewing, and the like was too much, even for the scientist to handle. So they wound up muting his microphone, which thankfully they were able to do, and making their way towards the second, more calmer subject. However, when they went to check on him, he wasn't moving. In fact, beside the single bite taken out of the burger that was given in the experiment, he pretty much didn't do or say anything, and the other sandwiches as well remained untouched. The group of scientists began trying to talk to the man, asking him if he was okay, if he needed a doctor, or anything like that. However, regardless of how many times he was questioned, he refused to answer to anyone, and instead slowly but surely began to shake. It was slightly at first, but then grew into a full-on seizure. This immediately caused the entirety of the scientists to rush into the chamber to examine the man, while a few the scientists who had, stayed behind, went and called the ambulances. The scientists did literally everything that they could to try and help save the man, but almost immediately as they had entered into the chamber, the man stopped shaking and then soon fell limp. One of the men checked his pulse, but could find nothing. CPR was done on the man for nearly 30 minutes. Yet unfortunately, the man had already died right then and there. The very scientist who had came in to try and save the man immediately walked out of the chamber and back into the viewing area that showed the two of the subjects. Upon returning, the first subject, who hadn't died, had already started to grow extremely violent, with rage coursing through his eyes like he was in the process of wanting to sit there and smash through the plexiglass window and kill anybody that was there. Unmuting the microphone that was in his room, the scientists were immediately met with a loud screeching and violent ramblings of the man, practically demanding more of the McDonald's hamburgers to satisfy his desires. Now really realizing that this man had pretty much gone off the deep end, he was quickly refused and told that the experiment was now over and that he would have to leave now. This was one of the worst decisions that the men had made. The man then went back to his seat and then proceeded to sit down and stay that way for a bit, not doing anything but simply glaring at the plexiglass. The testers thought that the man had finally decided to calm down and were ready to go into the other chamber where the body of the other person was at and prepare it for the ambulance to come and take it, when they suddenly heard a sickening sound of flesh being ripped and torn into and bone snapping in two. When they turned back, they found that the man had bitten off one of his fingers, rolled it around in whatever meat juices that was left in the wrapper that hadn't been eaten, and then proceeded to put it in his mouth and chew on it slowly. It was a disgusting sound. I mean, how he managed to do it without any kind of pain was unknown even to the scientists themselves. A doctor had wound up getting called into, and went into the chamber and tried to subdue the man into restraints, but instead, the man quickly pinned the man down onto the table and began to eat him. It didn't take long after that for the other scientists to burst into there and hold him down, giving him a few sedatives to try and calm him down as best as they could, while tending as best as they could to the wounds and injuries of the man. It didn't exactly take long for police to arrive on scene and arrest the first subject on the spot, while the other man was soon pronounced dead upon arrival by ambulance workers. After the autopsy of the second subject, who still to this day remains unnamed, it was later revealed that the ingredient EXP-43 had managed to trigger some kind of acidic reaction that had caused his brain, quite literally, to start melting in his head from the high dosage, until it was nothing else more than liquefied pink sludge that oozed out of his head during the autopsy. As for the first subject, while his brain didn't particularly melt into goo, he still suffered a lot of mental damage as well. Specifically, the gradual levels of the ingredient had been put into the meat had managed to trigger a higher release of dopamine than usual. With each increase of the juice, the more dopamine would be released and the more addicted the subject had become. This was further proven once the journal Subject 1 had been thoroughly evaluated by police, as the contents of said journal only described the man's deep love and affection for McDonald's food, and how he wanted to do anything as possible to get whatever kind of food he could get from Mickey D's, even going so far to say that he had stolen money from his wife and kids and a few other colleagues and friends to try and curb his cravings as well. Needless to say, the man was put into a psychiatric hospital in order to try and recover, but unfortunately he never did. He was never able to recover from what had happened to him. The man who had been thoroughly bitten into repeatedly, the doctor specifically, he did live though, so at least he's alive. Although the funny thing is that he never filed charges on the man who had managed to chew off a chunk of his flesh from his arm in a fit of insane hunger. Nobody to this very day apparently knows what exactly had went through the doctor's mind, but I guess the main thing that he wanted to do was just completely and utterly get out of there as quickly as possible. Now, you're likely thinking that McDonald's had wound up hearing about this incident, covered the whole thing up, and then proceeded to quit using the ingredient to flavor their patties with. Well, like I mentioned above, you'd be wrong on that one. McDonald's certainly covered the thing up quite well, paid everybody off that needed to be paid off, and basically just swept on all this underneath the rug. But the ingredient is still in use in every McDonald's around the world, although in much more smaller doses than the one that the subject was given. Even as I speak right now, as you yourself munch on that Big Mac or Quarter Pounder with cheese, or even that fillet of fish, you are ingesting that ingredient, which is slowly building up into you. And who's to say that even you yourself might sooner or later fall prey to the carnivorous and cannibalistic effects of EXP-43. In fear and surprise, as your eyes widen, your mouth goes dry with each battered breath. You try to scream, your mind begs to leave, glued to your computer screen. The killers they slash, the tapes burn and crash. The cartridge you bought will be your final haunt. The rituals of hate will seal your fate. The tears you shed will be from the fear-gripping horror-driven nightmarish gore-filled, terrorizing, hateful, burning, violent, rage-inducing, knife-slashing, blood-splattering, silent screams. Only time will tell if you will escape this online hell. Your horror-filled obsessions will come with its own regressions. Your pathetic screams will not be heeded in any way, because your nightmares will come at any